This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier.
I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
Protests have erupted across the country around police treatment of African Americans and systemic racism. But there's a growing understanding that racial disparities in the U.S. extend beyond policing to public health and the environment. Across the U.S., communities of color are more likely to breathe polluted air, live near polluting industries, and be exposed to toxic chemicals. And now, COVID-19 is disproportionately threatening these same communities. Can environmental policy address racial disparity? Is the environmental movement ready to take up the issue of race and racism in American society? Today, we're joined by Mustafa Santiago Ali. For 24 years, he worked at the EPA, and he was senior advisor for environmental justice and community revitalization and assistant associate administrator. He left in 2017 during the Trump administration. Ali was senior vice president at the Hip Hop Caucus, and now he's vice president of environmental justice at the National Wildlife Federation. Mustafa Santiago Ali, thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
We are in a week of protests. Have you been out protesting? And tell us what you've seen.
Yeah, it's funny. Over the past couple of decades that I've been doing this work, a part of it has always been being on the front lines with those who are trying to help make change happen. And what I'm seeing is that young people and a diversity of lots of different voices and faces and races are coming together to say that racism, these injustices that have continued to happen, the deaths that continue to happen can no longer be a part of our country. So, I'm just blessed to be surrounded by the energy and the innovation of so many folks who continue to put a spotlight, on the injustices that are happening from police, but even beyond that, the injustices that continue to happen to people of color. And that just speaks to the need for a cultural shift that we know is happening. And the need to make sure that no community is being disproportionately impacted, that no communities, whether in a rural or urban context, have to have their lives cut short.
So I want to ask you, while we're on the topic, do you see a link between the brutality that we've witnessed with the killing of George Floyd and others and the issues of environmental justice, environmental racism that you have worked on?
Oh, without a doubt, there is a direct connection that exists in that space. Lots of times, folks may not know that we've got 100,000 people who are dying prematurely from air pollution in our country every year. That's the conservative number. We know that disproportionately it is communities of color, lower wealth communities, and indigenous peoples who are the ones that are being disproportionately impacted from that. And out of that, they're also losing lives because of the chronic medical conditions that exist just from the air pollution side of the equation. These cancer clusters that are across our country. We also know that people are getting liver and kidney disease, people are getting heart disease, and people are also dealing with these lung diseases. And I bring up that latter part, because we also got 24 million people in our country who have asthma. And again, it's African American and Latinx communities are the ones that are disproportionately impacted by that. And if you look at Eric Garner, when we say I can't breathe, Eric Garner literally could not breathe because he had severe asthma. And then we had police officers, who did the nefarious things that they did to take his life. And then when we look at what's happening today with George and the police officer who placed his knee on his neck until he could no longer breathe. So there is a direct connection with the environmental injustices, the environmental racism that continues to happen, along with the disinvestment in communities of color and lower wealth communities, which in many instances creates these dynamics that allow people to assume that people are less than human who live in these communities. And also that then plays out in the policing and the tactics that are utilized. We all know that in wealthier white communities that we never see or hear one of police officers, using these military type tactics in those communities. But we also know that if we don't put a spotlight on it, then nothing's going to change.
So you've written a lot lately about the connections between COVID-19 and vulnerable communities. I was wondering if you could just talk about that. I mean, there has been It's sort of well known now that African Americans are disproportionately being affected and killed by this disease.
Once again, the direct connection happens both from air pollution and water pollution. There's been a lot of focus on air pollution. There's a Harvard study that came out that talked about COVID-19 and areas of our country that have higher levels of air pollution. And because of being exposed to that air pollution, those chronic medical conditions that I mentioned earlier become more ingrained in those communities, therefore making you more likely to be infected, and then therefore more likely to actually die from the disease because you have those chronic medical conditions. Many of us, in the writings that I've done and others, we talk about sacrifice zones. And what we mean by that is that, there are locations in our country where we place everything that nobody else wants. And because of the placing of those things, we're putting people's lives more at risk.
So in this historic moment that we're all witnessing, I want to ask you about some of the actions that people in the environmental movement have taken. By now you see basically almost every national environmental group has released a statement supporting racial justice. How does that square with you over what you've seen in the environmental movement throughout your career? And keeping in mind, I think we need to be explicit here, that the overwhelming majority of leaders of these groups are white. And I don't think it's inaccurate to say that they've been white-centered. How have they traditionally taken on issues of racial injustice? And are we seeing anything different right now?
No, that's an excellent question. The history of many of our conservation and environmental groups, of course, was not focused on communities of color. The environmental justice movement actually came to be because they did not have a seat at the table and their issues were not being focused upon. And if we're going to have real talk, some of the older conservation organizations actually have a racist past, especially in, thinking they're doing the right thing and the taking of lands and away from indigenous brothers and sisters. If you read some of the early writings of some of them also, they were very exclusionary in their worldview. Now, of course, that was then. This is now. And now, even over the last 40 years, there were a number of organizations who were very resistant. Actually, they refused to work on issues that were environmental issues, but they were environmental issues that were impacting supposedly mostly folks of color. Of course, there were lower wealth white communities also, but they were not necessarily focusing on that either. But there is an evolution that has happened. And I'm not going to say it's been an easy evolution. It is because there is a change that's happening in our country. But now there are organizations that, are building into their priorities, building into their strategic plans, the work, justice-centered work. But there's still others that have a long way to go. And I just want to also touch on a point that you raised. When we talk about structural inequality, and since we're having the conversation right now focusing on our environmental and conservation related organizations, if you want to know if real change is happening, then you look at the boards. What do the boards look like? Who are the individuals who are there? Because they're helping to also set the agenda. And the senior staff at these respected nonprofits. When you take a look there, and I always share this with all my friends who are in all these different organizations, it's a curious matter when you don't have one African American or if you don't have one Latinx person who's the president of any of these organizations. Even as you start to go down into the vice presidency and some of the other senior related positioning, that we're still a bit sparse when it comes to true representation. And we have to change that if we're going to win. If we're going to win on environmental issues, if we're going to win on climate issues, then that has to be a part of the change along with the work and the communities that we're focusing on.
Let me push you on that a little bit. Why is that important? Is it that, to put it bluntly, are these organizations seen as too white?
Well, look at many of the environmental and conservation organizations. You have an aging demographic in relationship to those who are members of that organization. We know that we have a changing demographic in our country and across the planet. If I am a person of color and I do not see myself represented in the leadership, on the boards, if I'm doing, if I'm going that deep into the research, into the sets of priorities and areas that you are focusing on, then I probably will make the assumption that this is not an organization for me. So there is a financial aspect that organizations need to be focused on, in the sense that if you want to continue to grow your base, then you better be in step with what the country is asking for. And if you really are serious about winning on climate change, then we need to go to the spaces and places that are the drivers in the emissions that are going on, and where the deforestation is happening, and a number of the other things, if we want to get into a wonky conversation, that are going to be necessary.
Do you see a shift in some environmental organizations that are traditionally, let's say, wildlife or habitat concerned organizations into issues like air and water pollution? I mean, these are issues that are disproportionately impacting Black, Latinx, and low-income communities?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. The answer is yes. I am seeing an evolution. I'd like that evolution to happen faster. Because, as I share with folks, that same pollution that is killing wildlife and making wildlife sick is the same pollution that's killing people. There was a study that came out that talked about our national parks, and lots of people like to, get out and go to our national parks. It's an opportunity to reconnect with nature. It's an opportunity to help to strengthen mental health, so forth and so on. But close to 90% of our national parks are now dealing with significant air pollution, which is mind blowing, that if those types of places, and that same pollution is the same pollution that is making, Black and brown folks sick, in urban centers and in other locations. So there is a commonality that exists there. For the fishermen and hunters, who know that water quality is so important to the things that they like to do, and for, outdoor enthusiasts, that's that same water pollution that is impacting, both rural and urban communities across our country of color. So there is an opportunity for folks to come together, and people are beginning to do it. We just need it to happen at a much larger and faster rate.
Okay, on top of everything that we've talked about, it is Black Birders Week, which ties into a lot of the things we've been talking about. Most people are aware of the situation with Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper in Central Park. Did you watch the video at all?
I sure did, and I've had conversations with a whole bunch of folks around it. As shocking as it is for some, that is not uncommon for folks of color, especially African Americans. That's one of the reasons that we need everyone to speak up. Let's tie it back again to the great folks in conservation, environment, and climate, right? So a part of that mission is making sure that people get out, to open spaces, whether those open spaces are in urban parks, like there in New York City, or many of the other locations. Well, if you're a person of color, it's not always safe for you to go to certain locations. One, because someone can pick up a phone and call a park ranger or call a police officer and say whatever they want to say. And of course, it's racially biased and racially tinged. But the person of color is the one who has to deal with it. And that's the exact same thing that happened there in Central Park, where unfortunately the lady decided that she wanted to weaponize her whiteness. I'm sorry, I just got to give it to you real.
Her privilege.
Yeah, her privilege. And it could have turned out in a much more tragic way, although it's still tragic that someone in 2020, and I remind folks of this, I wasn't around in 1960 or 1965 or, any of the times that our parents and grandparents had to deal with this type of discriminatory behavior. But, it's 2020. There is no reason that we have these types of things going on. And that's why it's so incredibly important. Black Birders Week, all the folks who are doing their best to be able to enjoy the outdoors, folks have got to come together, and they have to, raise the issue that these types of injustices are happening. But that can't be the end of the conversation. There has to be steps, both inside of our organizations, where we are strategically going to put plans together to address these types of issues, not just speaking out about it, but what are we structurally going to do? We also have to work with folks in our state houses and on Capitol Hill to make sure that we are also putting together the legislation that's necessary to end these types of behaviors. And if we're not willing to do that, then it's almost like seeing, we drive by an accident and we may say a quick prayer and hope everybody's all right, but then we move on. The tragedy is still there and still happening, and we can fix this. And that's the beauty of the moment. If we decide to actually come together, we can actually put enough pressure that we can begin to get the steps in place that are going to be necessary to make sure that everyone is protected and that there's accountability for those who want to do negative things.
This Christian Cooper incident brings up kind of an awkward and uncomfortable conversation around, the conservation movement or just the outdoors movement, whatever we want to call it. Our national parks and our state parks are great, but do Black and brown people feel excluded from these spaces?
Well, I think that there are a lot that do. If you're welcomed into a space or not. If you're not, of course, you're going to avoid that. Now, there are, groups of folks who hike and ski and of color and do all the other things. But, the question is, do the majority of folks feel safe? And we've got a lot of work to do there. So when you go to the parks, you don't see a lot of folks of color who are, who are the rangers. When you look at the marketing, you often don't see a lot of diversity in that. When we work with our outdoor rec organizations and companies, some of them are evolving, but some aren't. So there are lots of ways that we can, help to make sure that folks know that they are welcomed, but also that they're protected.
All right, I want to get to some of your work in the Office of Environmental Justice at the EPA. You resigned from the agency in March 2017 when the Trump administration proposed steep budget cuts and proposed even eliminating the EPA Office of Environmental Justice. That actually, ultimately, it still exists. It wasn't eliminated. But do you still have colleagues at the office? Have they been still working on these issues? Are they able to accomplish things in environmental justice under this current administration?
It's just a tough situation. Everybody's seen, all the news stories about the things that have been happening at EPA, from the political leadership, the rolling back of all the laws that so many people, including frontline communities who played such a critical role in getting in place. Because, folks take that oath to protect folks. It's just been very difficult, but there's still work that's happening. The great thing is that we've got just a few more months before we get a chance to vote and hopefully help make change happen. There are still some grant programs that are out there that are critical for folks, but I would be remiss if I didn't give it to you real. There are also a lot of contractions that have happened and eliminations of critical stuff. A part of the work that I did, I've worked in over 500 communities across the country. So for me, I asked the communities, do you see value in what's going on? What's your evaluation? Because we don't do that enough. We talk to folks inside the Beltway and assume that they say everything's okay, it's okay. So communities are saying that, they no longer have trust in EPA, that they no longer feel that there is a location where they can take their concerns and that they will be honestly evaluated and that there will be actions to help to deal with whatever those impacts are. And that is really where the rubber hits the road, because these are the taxpayers. These are their tax dollars. The staff at EPA are trying their best to do the right thing. But of course, they're not the ones who necessarily are guiding the ship.
Worry you when it comes to on-the-ground impacts in poor and minority communities?
Yeah. A part of me resigning, one, I tried to do it in an extremely respectful way. I had worked with Democrats and Republicans over the years. Everybody may have had slightly different policies, but I never felt that there was an administration that was intentionally trying to or going to hurt people and shorten people's lives. With this one, it was a completely different scenario. And I just have to raise also that they were very honest, though. So we have to take some responsibility also. They told folks exactly what they were going to do. The president told folks what he was going to do. He told you the kinds of people that he wanted to surround himself with, and people still gave their vote. I knew that they were going to make more people sick and that they were going to, unfortunately, shorten people's lives, and I knew that I couldn't be a part of that. I had hoped that I was incorrect, but unfortunately, it's been much more damaging than I had ever thought. You know, when they decided to roll back the Clean Power Plan, when they started to do this stuff around the Mercury Rule, when you move yourself out of the Paris Climate Accord, let's go back to the Clean Power Plan. In their own analysis with the new plan that they put in place, they even show that less people are going to be protected and less lives are going to be protected. For me, there's some culpability in that when you intentionally are doing things that you know are going to, unfortunately, make more people sick and more people are going to lose their lives.
So I read that you got an early start in this work, that you were 16 when you started working on these issues. What got you interested in this?
I started working on social justice issues. I was just super blessed. I come from a family, a faith-based family, but also a family that my brothers and sisters and they never told us what we had to do, but they did say you have to find a way to give back. And my dad and my grandfather were very focused on workers' rights. And as a young child, watching that and getting engaged and, going out to, some of the strikes and other things that were going on when people were trying to have better working conditions, when people were trying to, as folks say now today, make sure you have a living wage. And, I grew up in Appalachia and in Michigan. And in the small community that I grew up in, we had these crazy cancer rates. Folks will sometimes say, well, it's your diet. Well, no, because people grew their own food. And sometimes people will say it's a genetic thing. Well, my friends, they were white and their parents were getting, these high levels of cancers also. So it began to pay more attention to, and try to figure out, well, what's going on here that is causing these types of conditions. And then I was just super blessed that I was sort of adopted by a number of the civil rights leaders and early environmental justice leaders. And that's how I began to work on environmental justice issues, which at that time were called environmental equity. And the other term that was used was environmental racism.
Yeah, one of the first things that put a name on environmental racism, one of the faces to the names was, I believe, outside of Philadelphia, where there was an incinerator put into near a largely black community. Is that right?
Yeah, well, that's a part of the history. Also in Warren County, North Carolina, in the early 80s, people were literally laying down to stop trucks from coming into their community that were carrying PCBs, cancer-causing chemicals. And the interesting thing, when you go back and take a look at history, when people were making decisions about where they were going to place this landfill that was going to hold, this very toxic material, there were 7 other locations that were better suited when you look at hydrology and a number of other factors when you're trying to make some decisions. But they chose this African-American community to place it in, even though it wasn't one of the ones that was rated as the best place for it. But, if we go back through the history of our country, there's been some great things that our country has done. And then there's been some just really egregious and unacceptable and damaging things. And the environmental injustices are a part of that paradigm. If we look at how we displaced and took away indigenous people's lands, if we look at, it's always interesting when we talk about workers' rights and we talk about some of the other things, we look at slavery and how we gave slaves some of the most dangerous jobs. When we look at our Chinese brothers and sisters who played such a critical role in building our infrastructure, especially our railroads, and how they were placed in some dangerous situations, weren't allowed to, practice some of their cultural practices. We see all of this as a part. And I raise that because sometimes we go to the 80s and think about environmental justice. And some who are a bit more advanced will go to 1968 and with Dr. King and his work with the sanitation workers. We've had these issues and these problems for quite a while. And we actually can fix them if we decide we're going to prioritize and do the right thing.
Mustafa Santiago Ali, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you. Y'all stay blessed and keep putting a spotlight on the issues that need focus.
Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find us online at trumponearth.org or anywhere you get your podcasts. Write us a review and tell your friends while you're at it. The podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Our executive producer is Kathy Nauer. I'm Reed Frazier. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.